The year was 1836, and in the borderlands between Maryland and Delaware, fear traveled faster than the wind that whispered through the pine woods. Farmers spoke his name in hushed tones, while children were warned to never linger on the roads past sunset. His name was Elias Granger, a man whose cruelty etched him into the dark annals of American history. This was not a figure of folklore or a phantom used to frighten the young. Elias was real. He was flesh and blood, yet carried himself with a darkness that made him seem less than human and more like a predator in waiting. Unlike others who sought wealth through toil, Elias sought it through the suffering of others. His chosen victims were African Americans, free and enslaved alike, whom he captured, trafficked, and in far too many cases killed. But to understand how Elias came to embody such evil, we must step into his world, a place where slavery's grip was tightening, yet also being challenged by the whispers of abolition. It was a world where law and morality were blurred, and a man with no conscience could rise in the cracks between. Before I tell you what Elias did, before I describe the terror of those who crossed his path, I want you to take a moment with me. Stories like this are not easy. They are heavy, but they matter because they reveal the cost of silence, the danger of unchecked power, and the hidden truths buried under soil that once drank innocent blood. If you're here with me now, I ask you, like this video, share it so more eyes can open to the past. Subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon, because these are the stories that many would prefer we forget. But together, we won't let them vanish. Now, let's begin. Elias Granger was born in 1798 in Dorchester County, Maryland, to a family that straddled poverty and bitterness. His father, a failed farmer, taught him the lesson of survival not through work, but through dominance. His mother, silent and broken, gave him nothing of compassion. By the time Elias reached manhood, he had no anchor to morality, no ties to community, no higher vision beyond his own appetite. Neighbors described him as a boy who found pleasure in cruelty. He would trap animals, not to eat or use, but to watch them suffer. Dogs were beaten for sport, cats drowned without reason, and when questioned, his reply was simple: "It's mine to do as I please." That philosophy, carried into adulthood, would become the foundation for his crimes against human beings. By the 1820s, slavery was both the engine of Southern wealth and the fracture line of the nation. Maryland was unique, home to both enslaved and free black people who lived uneasily side by side. For opportunists like Elias, this presented an opening. Kidnapping free African Americans and selling them into slavery across state lines had become a lucrative, if illegal, trade. While the law recognized free papers and manumission documents, enforcement was weak and corruption was rampant. Men like Elias thrived in the shadows, knowing that the poor and powerless had no voice to fight back. Elias began as a scout for more established kidnappers. He would prowl the roads between Cambridge and Easton, eyeing lone travelers. He learned how to read the movements of the Underground Railroad, how to tell who was newly escaped, who was vulnerable, who could be snatched without notice. His employers praised him for his instincts, but Elias was not content to remain a servant to others. He hungered for control. By 1830, he had formed his own gang. Unlike Paddy Cannon's infamous Cannon-Johnson gang, which operated with a network of accomplices, Elias preferred a smaller, tighter circle bound by fear rather than loyalty. His right hand was a man named Curtis Dale, a brute with a scarred face and a history of drunken violence. Together, they set out not just to traffic, but to terrorize. Their victims were often young men and women, lured with false promises of work or safety. Sometimes Elias posed as a friendly guide, offering directions to weary travelers, only to ambush them in the woods. Other times he struck at night, dragging families from their cabins while neighbors turned away, too frightened to intervene. And yet, even among kidnappers, Elias stood apart for his cruelty. Where others sought only profit, he seemed to seek pleasure and domination. Survivors later whispered of his method, how he would force captives to walk miles barefoot over brambles, how he denied them water until their lips cracked, how he branded some with heated iron to mark them as his. The local black communities knew his name, and they feared it. Songs were whispered to warn travelers, cryptic rhymes that carried his legend like a warning bell. Step not east when the pines grow wide. Elias waits on the riverside. White authorities, meanwhile, looked the other way. Some were bribed. Others believed Elias was merely restoring property to its rightful owners. And so, for years, his crimes spread like a sickness with no cure. But every predator leaves a trail, and Elias was no exception. The whispers began to grow louder. Free black families spoke of disappearances. Abolitionists traveling through Maryland wrote of strange encounters, of riders who shadowed them through the woods, of screams carried by the wind. Rumors reached Philadelphia and Wilmington, where vigilance committees began to keep records, noting the names of those who had vanished and the regions where they were last seen. By 1836, Elias Granger's name was already etched into the nightmares of those who lived along the border. He was more than a man. He had become a symbol of what hatred, greed, and unchecked power could create. And yet, this was only the beginning of his story, because while Elias thrived in the shadows, cracks were forming in the silence around him. Witnesses would soon step forward, evidence would be uncovered, and the man who hunted and killed African Americans would find himself hunted in return. The question that haunted everyone was simple. Could Elias Granger ever truly be stopped, or would his evil slip into the soil, lingering beyond the man himself? The answer was not yet clear. The winter of 1836 pressed hard against the Maryland-Delaware border, but the cold did not stop Elias Granger's business. He thrived in that gray season, when desperation was thick and people were willing to betray their neighbors for a coin or two. His tavern became the meeting place for hunters, informants, and landowners, a place where no law seemed to exist. From its wooden rafters hung the smoke of cheap whiskey, the stink of sweat, and the low murmurs of men who bartered in lives as if they were trading cattle. In the official records, Elias was nothing more than a farmer who owned too much land for one man to till. But behind the closed shutters of his tavern, he was the silent broker of the human trade. Where some traffickers paraded their cruelty openly, Elias cloaked his violence in silence. He did not brag, he did not boast. He only watched, listened, and decided who would be taken. This aura of restraint made him more dangerous than the loudest bounty hunter. By early 1836, whispers of Elias's hunts had spread farther than he wished. Escaped men and women spoke of a tall figure with piercing gray eyes who tracked them by lantern light, who could follow broken reeds across the marsh as if guided by some unnatural instinct. Those who escaped spoke of his dogs, lean hounds that could run until their paws bled, and of the coldness with which Elias retrieved his quarry. Some claimed he killed to make an example. Others believed he killed simply because he could. The landscape itself seemed to favor him. The marshes between Seaford and Denton were treacherous, quick mud, black water, and tangled brush that swallowed footsteps. To the enslaved who tried to run north, this land was both shield and graveyard, and Elias knew every crooked path, every drowned hollow, every patch of high ground where fugitives might rest. It was said he could tell the age of a footprint in the mud by sight alone. But Elias did not work alone. Around him gathered a circle of men who owed him either money or fear. There was Henry Pike, a ferryman who carried runaways across the Nanticoke River, only to deliver them straight back into Elias's hands. There was Samuel Rowe, a gaunt farmer whose debt had driven him to betray his own neighbors. And then there was James Drummond, a deputy sheriff who had learned to look away whenever Elias delivered bodies or evidence to his door. Together, they formed a net stretched tight across the borderlands. Yet, even the strongest nets have holes. And in 1836, one hole appeared in the form of Ruth Carter, a free black woman whose brother had vanished one January night. Ruth had long warned her neighbors that Elias was no mere tavern keeper. She had seen him moving by torchlight in the marshes, had heard the screams carried on the wind from his barn, and she was determined to gather proof. But her efforts carried grave risk, for Elias had eyes everywhere. Even speaking his name in suspicion could bring his wrath. It was Ruth who would first record Elias's cruelty in a written statement delivered secretly to a Quaker meeting in Wilmington. In her account, she described finding fresh-dug earth near Elias's orchard, the ground stamped down by boots, the smell of lime rising from the soil. She wrote of hearing chains rattling when she passed his barn at night, though the building stood locked and shuttered. And most chilling of all, she described a child's doll half buried in the mud outside the tavern, its face cracked, its dress torn, and its owner never seen again. But Elias, always cautious, knew when eyes turned his way. He shifted his methods, grew more secretive, more careful. Instead of keeping captives on his property, he arranged for them to vanish quickly southward, where buyers waited with open purses. He stopped leaving traces near his orchard. He abandoned the barn for an old smokehouse deeper in the woods, a place where screams would not carry so far. Still, rumors spread. Runaways spoke of Elias in tones of dread, as if he were not a man but a shadow that could not be outrun. In nearby towns, preachers began warning their flocks of the hunter of men. Mothers whispered his name as a threat to keep children from wandering. And yet Elias grew richer, his tavern more crowded, his land more envied. The contradiction made him untouchable, the wealthiest man in the region and the most feared. The year 1836 would not pass quietly for him. As the Underground Railroad gained new strength, Elias found himself hunting more often. His tavern busier with men eager for reward money. But with each capture, each killing whispered of in secret, more voices rose against him. Ruth Carter was not alone. Others had begun to gather fragments of his story, fragments that when pieced together revealed a man whose crimes reached far deeper than anyone imagined. The hunt for Elias was no longer just his own pursuit. By mid-year, it had become a contest between his network of hunters and a growing resistance that refused to be broken. And for the first time, Elias would face adversaries who matched his cunning step for step, determined not only to free the captives he sought, but to expose the shadow empire he had built in the marshes of Maryland. It was here, in 1836, with winter not yet gone and summer still distant, that the battle lines quietly formed. Elias sharpened his knives and tightened his nets. His enemies sharpened their resolve. And in the marshes, where reeds whispered in the night wind, the ground waited patiently to receive the blood of whichever side would falter first. The year 1837 arrived with an early thaw, a rare gift of warmth that melted the snow before the first buds of spring appeared. For the people of Kent County, it was a relief, but for Elias Granger, it was an opportunity. He had grown comfortable, too comfortable, with the silence surrounding his crimes. He believed he had mastered the art of vanishing evidence. Yet cracks had begun to form, small but undeniable, in the carefully laid facade he had constructed. The first crack came from a letter. Sheriff Daniel Harker of Queen Anne's County had received a message from a Quaker farmer who lived just across the Maryland border. The farmer described seeing a man of broad shoulders and sharp jaw, traveling by night with chains in hand, herding men and women like cattle. The farmer's description matched Elias Granger exactly. Harker sent word to his deputies, but there was hesitation. Granger was no ordinary suspect. He was a landowner, well-known, and, in the eyes of many, untouchable. But whispers traveled faster than official documents. Neighbors began to mutter. Why did Granger's wagons roll down the road so heavily laden at night, yet return lighter by dawn? Why did the torches burn on his property at hours when decent folk were asleep? The unease turned to dread when, that March, the body of a young black man was pulled from the Choptank River, his wrists bound, his head marked by a wound too precise to be an accident. Though no official declaration was made, everyone knew what it meant. Someone had begun to fight back, and Elias was answering with murder. Still, Elias thrived on silence. Fear protected him better than any wall. He visited local taverns, drinking whiskey with merchants and planters, laughing loudly, masking his violence under the guise of normalcy. To some, his presence was reassuring. To others, it was suffocating. He seemed to grow more emboldened each year, a predator that had convinced itself no hunter dared aim a rifle his way. But another crack appeared, one Elias did not anticipate. A boy, no older than 14, had been hiding near the edge of Granger's fields one night, searching for his father's stray mule. From the cover of a thicket, he saw Elias drag 3 men, bound at the wrists, across the dirt path. The boy watched as Elias struck one of them for stumbling, watched the man collapse, and watched Elias leave him there in the mud without hesitation. The boy, trembling, ran home, and the next day his mother wrote a letter to a Methodist preacher known for his abolitionist sympathies. That preacher, Reverend Amos Fletcher, carried the words north. Now, the story of Elias Granger was no longer confined to whispers among farmers and freedmen. It had entered the mouths of men who stood in pulpits, who believed that sin could not remain buried beneath soil or drowned in rivers. The Reverend told congregations in Philadelphia and Wilmington that there was a man in Maryland, one who hunted not animals, but human beings. He spoke with righteous fury, his words rippling out like stones cast into a still pond. Elias, of course, heard of these sermons. He laughed. To him, northern preachers were windbags who stirred up noise but lacked claws. He believed that distance and jurisdiction were shields. What could a man in Philadelphia truly do to him? A man who knew every bend of the eastern shore and every bribe that would silence a deputy. Yet, beneath his laughter, something shifted. A flicker of awareness that his name was now spoken in places he could not control. The community around him was caught between fear and complicity. Some despised him, but they despised him quietly. Others admired his audacity. After all, the law of profit had no moral compass. If Elias grew rich from selling men and women to the deep South, was he not simply exploiting opportunity like any other businessman? This was the cruel logic of the age. Morality bent beneath the weight of commerce. By summer of 1837, Elias's operations grew bolder. He began constructing holding pens disguised as tobacco sheds. These makeshift prisons were small, windowless, and reeked of despair. Those who passed by heard nothing. Elias knew how to gag and bind, but those who drew close enough noticed shadows moving behind the wood slats, and they looked away. Always they looked away, and yet resistance persisted, though quietly, carefully. A network of freedmen and sympathetic farmers began passing information about Elias's movements. They marked the nights his wagons departed, the paths he favored, and where the smoke from his chimneys carried the scent of burning cloth or flesh. This network had no official name, but later, historians would point to it as one of the precursors to the organized lines of the Underground Railroad. In those early years, it was simply neighbors refusing to remain silent. The boy who had once witnessed Elias dragging captives would grow into a man who never forgot the sight. But in 1837, he was still a child, haunted, his words dismissed by some, but treasured by others who recognize the truth children often see more clearly than adults. His story, carried in hushed tones, gave shape to Elias's brutality. It made him less of a rumor and more of a monster with a face. Elias, for all his cunning, was not blind. He sensed the air shifting, the eyes watching. He moved with sharper precision, striking harder, ensuring no trail lingered. But he also felt the thrill of being hunted himself. It awakened in him something darker, a desire not just to capture, but to kill. Where once he might have spared those who resisted, now he destroyed them as warnings. Each body discarded was a message written in blood: silence me, and you die. The tide, however, was no longer fully his to command. Letters continued to spread, sermons grew louder, and whispers refused to die. Elias had built his empire on the belief that secrecy could outlast morality. But secrecy is fragile. It cracks with each witness, each rumor, each sermon, until even the strongest facade collapses. The year closed with more unease than certainty. People still feared him, but fewer respected him. The cracks were widening, and through them light began to slip, and Elias, though unshaken on the surface, could feel the tremors below his feet, as if the very ground he walked was no longer steady. By the spring of 1837, the shadow that Elias Granger cast across Maryland was impossible to ignore. Whispers had turned into accusations, but accusations were dangerous things in a place where Granger's allies still held sway. Merchants, landowners, and even certain sheriffs owed him favors, and those who dared to speak against him often found themselves ruined, or worse. Yet the tension in the community was building, and the mask Granger wore in public began to crack. He could not silence every voice, nor erase every trace of the atrocities he had committed. The spark came not from a powerful man, but from a grieving mother. Sarah Williams had lost 2 sons to the Night Riders, a group that people in hushed voices knew Elias commanded. Her boys had been dragged from their cabin in the middle of the night, accused of plotting escape, though they had never left the county. Their bodies were found weeks later, weighted down in the shallows of the Choptank River. Sarah refused to bury her grief in silence. She stood in the town square with torn clothes and held up a blood-stained shirt, screaming Elias Granger's name for all to hear. This act of defiance rippled through the community. Those who had been too afraid to speak began to murmur that perhaps Elias was not untouchable. A preacher, Reverend James Holloway, used his pulpit to suggest that the devil himself might walk among them in the form of a man. Without naming Elias directly, his words carried weight, and the congregation knew exactly whom he meant. For the first time, a seed of resistance had been planted, but Elias was not a man to be threatened. He responded with a performance of piety and order. Hosting a grand gathering at his estate, he invited sheriffs, judges, and landowners. He spoke of law, order, and the preservation of the community. He condemned those who would sow discord with lies and slander, and claimed that he, too, grieved for the wayward souls lost to folly and sin. His ability to twist perception was uncanny. Some in the audience nodded in agreement, while others felt a chill. Behind the scenes, Elias plotted his counterstroke. He sent his riders to intimidate Sarah Williams, burning her modest home to the ground. Though she survived, she was forced into hiding, her act of bravery nearly snuffed out. Yet the attempt backfired. The fire that consumed Sarah's cabin became a symbol, proof that power feared the truth. People began to gather in secret, sharing stories of what they had seen, what they had lost, and who they believed was responsible. Elias had always thrived in silence, but now the silence was breaking. It was around this time that the first real piece of evidence surfaced. A farmer named Caleb Morton discovered a shallow grave while plowing a remote patch of land leased by Granger's men. Inside were the remains of 3 people, bound at the wrists. Rumors spread quickly, and though Elias denied any knowledge, the timing was disastrous for him. Reverend Holloway and others began to quietly compile testimonies, creating what might one day be used against Elias in a court. The community stood on a knife's edge. Fear and courage wrestled for dominance in the hearts of ordinary people. Elias, sensing the shift, grew increasingly paranoid. He began patrolling the woods himself, lantern in hand, hunting shadows as though they were enemies. His nights were restless, haunted by what he had done. But his cruelty did not lessen. If anything, it grew sharper, more desperate. Those closest to him began to fear not only his wrath, but his unraveling mind. And yet, even in the midst of fear, hope stirred. A hidden network, led by Reverend Holloway and a few trusted allies, sought to protect those who might be targeted next. They began moving people quietly out of the county, beyond Elias's reach. This underground effort would later be recognized as one of the first organized attempts at resistance in that region. The confrontation between Elias and the growing resistance was inevitable, but the timing and manner of it remained uncertain. Would Elias crush this flicker of defiance, or would the weight of his sins finally pull him down? The people who whispered his name in dread now began to ask a dangerous question aloud. What if Elias Granger could be stopped? That question, once unthinkable, was the first true threat Elias ever faced, and it would set the stage for the storm that was coming. By the fall of 1837, the mood in the town had shifted. Whispers of Elias Granger's night hunts and missing freedmen had grown too loud to ignore. The magistrate's office had received anonymous letters, crude in handwriting but consistent in message. Search the riverbanks. You will find what you fear. Still, no official dared to confront Elias outright. His reputation was ironclad, his wealth substantial, and his temper legendary. To accuse him without proof would be akin to signing one's own death sentence. Yet, beneath this silence, a quiet resistance was stirring. It began with the families. Freedmen who had settled near the Delaware line noticed patterns, their livestock disappearing, strange fires near their cabins, the sound of riders at night. Mothers clutched their children tighter when the leaves began to fall, for they knew the hunting season was not for deer, it was for them. Rumors spread of Elias keeping trophies, buttons from coats, lockets, even a strip of cloth with blood too stubborn to wash out. Among the townspeople, 2 figures stood apart. One was Reverend Alden Pierce, a minister new to the county, who had come from Massachusetts with fiery sermons about the dignity of all souls. The other was Martha Ellison, a midwife whose work took her into every cabin and homestead, white and black alike. Both had heard too many stories that mirrored one another. Children missing, bodies glimpsed at dawn in the marsh, and riders masked in burlap, with Elias's distinct gait leading them. But Elias was clever. He anticipated suspicion. In church he sat in the front pew, head bowed as though humbled. At fairs he gave to the poor with coins clinking heavily in their palms. His barn was filled with more horses than any man should rightly own. Yet, when asked about their brands, he claimed inheritance. The law looked the other way, for it was easier to believe in Elias the benefactor than Elias the butcher. One evening, Martha Ellison followed the sound of dogs howling. She crept along the ridge until she saw the glow of lanterns near Elias's field. There, men dug into the earth. She swore she heard crying, faint, muffled, like a child's voice swallowed by dirt. Martha fled before she was seen, but the image carved itself into her mind. The next morning she confided in Reverend Pierce, her voice shaking. "They are burying the living," she whispered, and the Reverend's knuckles whitened around his Bible. Together they began to gather evidence, not in bold confrontations, but in fragments: a bloodied shirt found snagged on a fence, a ledger with names crossed out too neatly, a locket inscribed with initials of a boy reported missing. They stored these items in a locked chest beneath the church floorboards. Yet fear gnawed at them, for Elias's reach extended into the very men who were sworn to uphold justice. Meanwhile, Elias's own behavior grew darker. Perhaps the thrill of the hunt was not enough, or perhaps whispers of defiance reached his ears. He began to leave signs, deliberate and cruel: a child's doll nailed to a church door, a ring placed on the step of a cabin whose owner had vanished days before. These were not accidents, but messages. "I see you. I own the night." The tension reached its breaking point in November. A young freedman named Isaiah disappeared after being seen working in the mill. His mother raised her voice in the square, accusing Elias outright, her wails echoing like a curse. Within days, her cabin was burned to the ground. No one saw her again. That silence, so sudden, so brutal, shook the town. For the first time, even those who had defended Elias began to murmur with doubt. Reverend Pierce, his voice quivering yet resolute, preached one Sunday about Cain and Abel. He spoke not of brothers, but of hunters and prey, of blood crying out from the ground. The congregation sat stiff, many refusing to meet his eyes. But Elias did. He smiled faintly as though daring the Reverend to name him aloud. That smile haunted Pierce in his sleep for nights after, and yet, even in the darkness, courage flickered. A group of townsfolk, farmers, mill workers, and mothers whose children had vanished, met in secret at Martha Ellison's cottage. By candlelight, they swore an oath. If the law would not act, they would. They began to map Elias's routes, mark the nights he rode, note the direction of his dog's howls. For the first time, the hunter would be hunted. But Elias was not a fool. He sensed the air shifting, the eyes that lingered too long when he passed. He doubled his patrols, hired new hands loyal to him, and began carrying a rifle wherever he went. He told those in his circle, "The vermin are restless. Best to stamp them out before winter." His men laughed, but behind their laughter lay unease. They knew Elias's hunts were no longer secret shadows, they were becoming public spectacles. And so, the town found itself teetering. On one side, a man with wealth, fear, and violence to silence dissent. On the other, a growing resistance, fragile yet burning with righteous anger. It was not yet an uprising, nor was it submission. It was something in between, a brittle waiting. What no one knew then was that the next disappearance would unravel Elias's carefully woven shroud of terror. Because, for the first time, it would not be a freedman, nor a nameless wanderer, but someone whose absence the town could not dismiss. Someone whose blood would seep through the cracks of denial and force the community to see Elias Granger for what he truly was. The storm was coming, and when it broke, no one, neither the hunter nor the hunted, would remain untouched. The summer of 1837 was the turning point, the moment when Elias Granger's reign of terror began to collapse under the weight of its own cruelty. For years, his crimes had been whispered about, his name carried on the wind like a curse, but nothing had ever been done. Too many people were afraid. Too many were complicit. Too many profited from the fear he sowed. Yet, as is always the case in history, the greater the cruelty, the greater the eventual backlash. And that backlash began not with men of power or influence, but with the very people Elias had spent his life hunting. One night, a group of fugitives made it across the Maryland line, bruised and bleeding but alive. They told of Elias, of his dogs, of the iron chains he carried like trophies. Their stories reached the ears of a man named Josiah Bell, a free black preacher who had spent years working along the Underground Railroad. Josiah was not naive. He knew the dangers. He had heard of Elias long before, but until now, Elias had been more legend than flesh. Now, with fresh wounds and first-hand accounts, the legend became undeniable truth. Josiah made it his mission to stop him, not through vengeance, but through exposure. At the same time, a schoolteacher named Sarah Whitcomb began to gather testimonies in secret. She had grown up in the same county as Elias, had heard the same rumors, had even taught children whose parents worked for him. But she refused to let fear keep her silent. Sarah wrote everything down: names, dates, places. She met with Josiah and others who risked everything to document the truth. What they assembled was not just rumor or hearsay, it was evidence. And evidence, once placed in the right hands, could change everything. But Elias was not ignorant of what was happening. He felt the ground shifting beneath him. The fearful whispers in taverns had grown louder. The stares lasted longer. The silence of his neighbors was no longer submission, but calculation. He had ruled by fear, but fear only lasts until the moment it turns into anger. Elias doubled down on his cruelty, dragging more captives through the woods, beating them in full view of his workers as a reminder of what awaited anyone who defied him. He wanted to stamp out the growing spark before it became a fire. Yet that very cruelty became his undoing. On a hot August night, one of Elias's captives escaped. His name was Samuel, a young man of remarkable strength and willpower. Samuel had been chained in Elias's cellar for weeks, waiting to be sold south. But when Elias left his shackles loose, too drunk to secure them, Samuel broke free. He fled through the woods, barefoot, torn by thorns, driven by nothing but the desperate will to live. And he made it to Josiah Bell's house, collapsing at his doorstep. When Josiah and Sarah saw Samuel's condition, the scars across his back, the iron still clamped to his wrist, they knew the time for whispers was over. They took Samuel to a magistrate sympathetic to their cause, a man weary of turning a blind eye to the horrors unfolding in his county. Samuel's testimony was written down, signed, and sealed. For the first time, Elias Granger's name appeared not in rumor, but in official records. Still, Elias was not easily cornered. He had friends in high places, men who owed him favors, men who feared that exposing him would expose their own sins. More than once, Sarah's papers disappeared mysteriously or witnesses recanted after being threatened. But momentum was building, and Elias could not silence everyone. Each act of intimidation only made people more determined to see him fall. By the winter of that year, something remarkable happened. Elias Granger, the man once seen as untouchable, began to be hunted himself. Vigilante groups formed in secret, moving by night, protecting fugitives, sabotaging Elias's operations. His wagons were burned, his traps dismantled, his dogs poisoned. No longer was the fear one-sided. Elias looked over his shoulder constantly, his paranoia growing. He had lived as predator, but now, for the first time, he felt like prey. And yet, even in the face of growing resistance, Elias refused to yield. He convinced himself he was invincible, chosen, destined to rule through blood. He drank more, grew more reckless, and lashed out violently at even imagined slights. His farmhouse became a fortress of rage, the windows shuttered, the cellar reeking of damp earth and misery. But the walls were closing in. It was Josiah Bell who gave voice to what many already knew. Elias Granger is a man drowning in his own cruelty, and like all men who drown, he will drag others with him unless we act. History often turns on a single moment, a choice, an act, a spark that ignites everything. And in the story of Elias Granger, that moment was fast approaching. The evidence was gathered, the people emboldened, the law forced to take notice. Elias had built his empire on fear, but he had forgotten the one truth that destroys all tyrants. Fear is never eternal. Because when enough people stop being afraid, even the most monstrous man begins to fall. The trial of Elias Granger was unlike anything the people of Ohio had seen before. The courthouse in Franklin filled with a strange mixture of townsfolk, abolitionists, free black families, and even slave catchers who had traveled from neighboring states, curious to see what would become of a man who had played both sides of America's darkest conflict. Granger's face betrayed little emotion as he was led in shackles, his posture straight, his eyes cold. The prosecutor began by laying out a narrative that seemed to stretch the very fabric of justice. Elias Granger was not simply a murderer. He was the architect of a reign of terror, one that blurred the line between bounty hunting and outright genocide. Witnesses came forward, trembling as they recounted what they had seen. A farmer described the night he watched Granger and his men drag 3 people from a wagon, shooting one in the back when he tried to flee. A woman testified how her husband had been taken by Granger, never to return, his last words echoing through the trees as he begged for mercy. But it was the testimony of escaped men and women that cut deepest into the silence of that courtroom. They told of the hunts, how Granger released his dogs, how he laughed when their screams echoed through the forests, how he kept a tally, not only of captives returned, but of bodies left behind. He had written it all down, they said, in a ledger like one might track livestock. Each mark represented a human life erased or enslaved. The defense tried to argue that Granger had acted within the law, enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act that bound even free states to the cruel machinery of slavery. But the more the trial dragged on, the clearer it became that Granger was no simple enforcer. He had gone far beyond the law, treating murder as sport, cruelty as livelihood. His own words, pulled from letters seized in his home, damned him further. "The woods are my kingdom," one read, "and the dark-skinned my prey." The crowd gasped, but it was not merely shock. It was shame. For in those words, many saw the reflection of a society that had allowed such men to thrive. Abolitionists rose in the gallery, crying out that this was the natural fruit of a poisoned tree, that Elias Granger was not an outlier, but a symptom. Yet others, farmers, traders, men with their own quiet ties to southern markets, shifted uncomfortably, as if they too were being judged. The judge, a stern man known for his rigid adherence to law, found himself presiding over something larger than a murder case. This was about conscience. Could a man be condemned for atrocities that the law itself, in its perverse construction, sometimes seemed to encourage? As the trial stretched into its second week, a pattern emerged. Granger had never acted alone. His hunts were carried out with accomplices, men who now denied their role or claimed they were just following orders. The ledger confirmed otherwise. Each name matched to a date, each death carefully notated. Elias himself remained silent, refusing to look at his accusers, his lips pressed tightly together as though he believed the trial beneath him. Some whispered he still expected to walk free, that his allies in the shadows would see to it, but others began to sense cracks in his armor. At night in his cell, guards reported, Granger muttered to himself, speaking names only he remembered, reliving his hunts as if haunted by the very voices he had tried to silence. The climax came when one final witness was called, a boy of 15, wiry, eyes full of fire. He had escaped Granger's grasp months before, hiding in barns and caves until sympathetic farmers led him to safety. His testimony was short but devastating. "He told me I'd never make it to manhood," the boy said, his voice trembling yet steady, "because men like him would see to it. He said the woods belonged to him, and that I was nothing but meat for his dogs. But I lived. I lived to say his name here so he can't hide anymore." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of those words crushing the air itself. Even Granger, for the first time, blinked hard, his jaw tightening as if the boy's survival was a wound deeper than any verdict could deliver. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, their verdict rang through the courthouse like thunder. Guilty on all counts. Guilty of murder, guilty of kidnapping, guilty of crimes that even the law had no language sufficient to define. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn 1 month later. Yet, as the gavel struck and the people exhaled, no one felt triumph. The abolitionists knew that one man's punishment did not undo the system that had made him possible. Free black families wept, some for justice, some for memories of those who would never return. And even among the townsfolk, a chill settled in. Elias Granger had been condemned, but his shadow still stretched across the nation. For how many others, still out there, hunted without ever facing such reckoning? The execution date approached, and the air grew heavy with anticipation. Some said Elias spent his final nights writing, scratching on scraps of paper he demanded from guards, though what he wrote no one knew. Others whispered he had stopped speaking altogether, as though saving his last words for the noose. The gallows rose in the center of town, a grim monument to closure that felt anything but. When dawn finally came, and Granger was led out in chains, a hush fell over the crowd. His eyes were hollow, his body thinner, yet he walked with a stiffness that seemed almost defiant. The rope waited. The crowd pressed closer, and in that moment, everyone knew this was not an end. It was a reminder, because as Elias Granger stepped onto the platform, the woods beyond the town still whispered. The ledger still existed, heavy with the names of the lost. And the boy's words lingered above all. Men like him were still out there. The hunt had not ended. It had only been exposed. By the time 1836 gave way to 1837, the name Elias Granger carried a bitter weight. The region whispered it like a curse, as if simply invoking it might call forth the shadow of the man who had spent years tracking, tormenting, and slaughtering those who sought nothing more than the right to live free. His legend had grown not from triumphs, but from atrocities so systematic that even the bravest in Maryland and Delaware shuddered at the thought of his presence. Yet, what makes this part of the story so chilling is not only the record of his crimes, but the way his image began to warp in the memories of those who lived in his shadow. In taverns and courthouses, a strange duality took root. To slaveholders, Elias was still a kind of vigilante savior, a figure who punished those they considered runaways or thieves of human property. To abolitionists and to black communities, he was no less than a ghostly predator. And yet, in both circles, his myth began to separate from the man. They spoke of his uncanny ability to appear and vanish, of his eyes that seemed to glint even in moonless woods, of dogs that howled in his presence without cause. In reality, Elias Granger was still a flesh-and-blood man, but in the landscape of memory and story, he had already become something more, a nightmare carried across generations. This transition into folklore is important because it demonstrates how horror lingers not just in action, but in repetition. Granger's deeds were echoed in the stories that parents told their children at night, warnings wrapped in terror. A mother might whisper, "Stay close, do not wander. If the night swallows you, Granger will find you." A father might hush his family as they pass through dark forests. "Step lightly. This is where his boots left no print." Whether true or not, these tales imprinted the trauma deeper into cultural memory, ensuring his shadow extended beyond his life. Meanwhile, abolitionist writers of the late 1830s began to seize upon his notoriety. Pamphlets circulated in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, telling of Granger's cruelty in feverish prose. Though some exaggerated, many accounts were rooted in survivors' testimonies. The branding of captives, the mock trials he staged in barns, the eerie silence he demanded before executions. In framing him as a symbol of the institution itself, they exposed his evil as not merely personal, but systemic. They argued Elias Granger was not a rogue beast, but a symptom of a world willing to sanction violence in the name of order. This framing terrified his defenders. Planters who once praised him now distanced themselves, claiming he acted beyond reason, a lone madman. But by then, the line between truth and story was irretrievably blurred. Was Granger the deranged lone wolf his supporters insisted, or the arm of a corrupt system, as abolitionists argued? The answer was both, and it was this ambiguity that preserved his infamy. Even after his death, strange reports persisted. Farmers told of hearing boots crunching snow outside their cabins, though no tracks could be found. A group of children swore they saw a man in a wide-brimmed hat standing by the edge of the river, though he vanished when their fathers arrived. His jail cell, preserved for years after his execution, became a site of curiosity. Some visitors claimed to feel a chill pass through them upon stepping inside, as if the walls themselves had absorbed his malice. For African American communities, especially those with ties to the Underground Railroad, Elias Granger's memory became something more purposeful. His cruelty was remembered not to glorify him, but to keep alive the costs of freedom. Families told and retold stories of the lives he shattered as a reminder of resilience, a way to preserve the dignity of those who had perished. In these oral traditions, Elias Granger was not immortalized as a man, but damned as a specter whose evil could never overshadow the courage of those who resisted him. And yet, history has a peculiar way of forgetting selectively. By the late 19th century, his name had receded from the public record, tucked into the margins of local histories or the pages of abolitionist tracts that few revisited. What endured were fragments, the folk tales whispered in black families, the sermons of ministers warning against cruelty disguised as righteousness, the ghost stories told on winter nights. Elias Granger, in death, was reduced to both less and more than he had been. Less, because the specifics of his deeds blurred into legend. More, because in that blur he became an archetype of evil. And here is where the final twist emerges. In the 20th century, archivists stumbled upon forgotten county records, trial documents, testimonies, depositions. For the first time in over a century, the cold details of his crimes resurfaced. What was myth was shown to be rooted in fact, and what was fact seemed even darker than the folklore. Suddenly, Elias Granger's story was told anew, not just as an eerie whisper, but as documented history. The reappearance of these documents reminds us of the truth at the heart of this story. Horror does not vanish simply because time passes. Memory may distort, but the scars remain. Elias Granger is no longer alive, but his tale survives as a chilling intersection of history and myth, morality and violence, warning and legend. He was both a man and more than a man, both an individual monster and a mirror of a monstrous system. And so, As we stand at the edge of his story, we must ask, what does it mean to remember? To pass down his name is to confront the past. To silence it is to risk repeating it. Elias Granger's shadow lingers, not because of who he was, but because of what he represents. He is not simply buried in 1837. He walks, in memory, as long as we tell his tale. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence after the final words were spoken. Elias Granger, once the hunter, now the hunted, sat with chains biting into his wrists, the iron clinking softly with every shift of his trembling hands. No roar of anger, no cry of defiance remained in him. Only a hollow stare fixed somewhere beyond the wooden beams of the ceiling, as though he already saw the noose waiting in the morning air. The people of Sussex County had gathered in numbers too great for the courthouse to contain, their faces pressed against glass panes, their ears straining at the shutters, desperate to hear the outcome of a trial that had become more than just justice for Elias. It was a judgment on an entire era of cruelty. The judge's gavel cracked once, sharp as thunder, and the words were delivered, "Elias Granger, for crimes of murder, abduction, and human bondage, you are sentenced to death by hanging." The crowd outside erupted, not in cheers, but in a strange, muted release, as though the county itself had exhaled a poisoned breath it had been holding for decades. For the families who had buried their sons in shallow graves, who had seen daughters dragged into wagons, never to return, the words were a confirmation that memory had not been erased. Yet, beneath the solemnity of justice, fear lingered. For Elias had not acted alone. He was a man, yes, but a man enabled by silence, by neighbors who looked the other way, by taverns that welcomed his coin though they knew the source of his wealth, and the whispers that passed through the crowd that night carried the weight of that complicity. Some said the judge's words would close the wound. Others muttered that cutting down one man would not end the sickness rooted in the soil. On the morning of his execution, the gallows rose like a grim monument against the gray sky. Farmers left their fields, merchants closed their shops, children perched on their fathers' shoulders to witness the spectacle that history promised to remember. Elias climbed the wooden steps with the same boots that had once trodden through swamps on midnight hunts. But now, those boots echoed with finality. His face, once red with drunken rage, now pale, almost unrecognizable, as if drained of the fire that had driven him for so long. The rope was placed around his neck. For a moment, he seemed about to speak, his lips parting as though confession or defiance might emerge. But nothing came. Perhaps there were no words to cover a lifetime of cruelty. Perhaps he realized that any sound would be swallowed by the cold morning wind, and so the silence remained. When the trapdoor fell, it was not only Elias who dropped. It was a chapter of American history descending violently into memory, unresolved yet unforgettable. In the weeks that followed, Sussex County felt strangely altered. The swamps grew quiet, no longer cut by the distant cries of those Elias pursued. The taverns, once his haunts, stood with their windows shuttered, their keepers unwilling to speak his name. Yet in certain corners, bitterness grew. There were men who muttered that Elias had been betrayed by his own kind, punished not for his deeds but for being too visible, too reckless in a world that still tolerated the shadows of his crimes. They swore to keep the legacy alive, and it is there, in those whispers, that the ghost of Elias Granger lingered most. Because stories like his never truly die. They coil in the cracks of history, re-emerging in new forms when silence allows them space to grow. The children of those who had watched the hanging would carry the memory of the man who once prowled the swamps, who turned human lives into trophies. They would tell the tale with a mixture of horror and fascination, until Elias himself became less a man than a specter, a warning of what happens when cruelty is left unchecked, when neighbors look away, when humanity is reduced to prey. And so, standing here with you now, we are left with the haunting question. Was Elias Granger's end justice, or was it merely theater? Did the rope cleanse the land, or did it only cover the wound with another layer of silence? We may never know, but his story remains, etched in the darker pages of American history, waiting for us to decide whether we confront it, or whether we, too, will look away. If you think this is where the horrors of the past end, you are mistaken. Because just a few years later, another figure would rise, carrying forward a different kind of cruelty, one that history tried to bury, but could not erase. And if you skip that story, you'll miss the chilling connection that ties Elias Granger's legacy to something far more disturbing. So stay with us, because what comes next may change the way you look at history forever.